In this final video for the first module, I'm going to introduce you to naming, cleanup, and saving. This is not all the cleanup passes, this is not everything you need to do going forward or things to check, but this will give you a foundation that you can build on. It's very important that as you're working in a 3D pipeline that you keep things clean and efficient from the very beginning. You don't want things to get messy, you don't want things to become problematic because they can actually break and cause issues down the road. So to show this, I'm going to start by creating a cube primitive, and it's already put it at the origin for me, which helps me out because I want to make sure that when I build at the origin and at right angles as often as possible. Now there are things that are going to change that, they're going to have different shapes, but as much as I can, I want to build at the origin at right angles. Now with this cube here, I'm going to open up the attribute editor to start showing you some information. Now, by default, the cube has a bunch of different tabs under the attribute editor. The first tab is the transform, which also shows its position. So as you see me drag this out, you can see that translate changed. So this is another way of changing things. So I can drag this out to 2. I can make that go up to 10. Actually, I'll step back just to a 1 so you can see. And this one to a -2. The rotate can be 45 degrees, that will be 90 degrees, and you see that it's moving. So that's another way of adjusting things. You can actually do it by hand and manually input specific coordinates. But that's what it relates to. That's the transform, that's the information for the object. The second tab is the mesh information. The third tab is the primitive information. The fourth tab and the fifth tab are both relating to the texture. So by default, every object that's created is assigned the default shader, which in this case is Lambert 1. This is what creates that texture. So you see if I move this up or down, or I can grab this color and change it, it affects the object. I'm actually going to Control Z to undo that. By the way, if you're working on a Mac, it's also Z or Command Z to get the same undo function. But that's what those tabs are. Now, before I actually use an object, I actually want to clean this up quite a bit. I will start by naming it. Now, to name it, I don't want to name this second tab. If you can't see it, if there's too much stuff on there, for example, if the attribute editor is shrunk down, which it's not doing for me right now, usually there's some white arrows at the top that will allow you to tab back and forth if you have too many tabs on here. But you want to get all the way to the left to the one that's called transform. Now the reason we named the transform and not the mesh is because the mesh will update automatically if I update the name on the transform. So in this case, I will call it my cube. And for the naming conventions, you can use underscores for spaces, so my cube 1 or whatever else. Do not use other types of symbols. So don't use exclamation points, question marks, periods, dashes. So stuff like that is not good. In most cases, when you're naming things or naming files, it's a good idea just to use underscores. Also, don't use spaces because there's certain instances where that can become problematic. So I will call this my cube 1. And when I hit enter, you notice the second tab updated. So it's my cube shape 1. Now there's still that polycube tab there because that's saving some of the history of the creation. And so I can adjust that if I want to. But when I'm done, when I go, hey, this is my object, I'm happy with it the way it is. I've done my modeling, I've done my cleanup, I need to do something about it. Then you're going to do something called deleting history. So if I come up here to the top and I go edit, delete all by type, history, you notice that third tab just disappeared. That's because it's saying this is the default state. I shouldn't have a tab that allows me to manipulate it. So the manipulation's over. I've just gotten rid of that history, that creation history. This is my regular state. The other thing that'll happen is I need to freeze the transforms. Right now my transforms are frozen. If you notice, my translate and my rotate are both set to 0s and my scale is at 1, so my transforms are frozen. But if I do something like moving it over here, you see my translates have changed and my scale can be changed. What that does is now it's saying, okay, here's where things have been adjusted to. If I freeze the transform, so if I go modify, freeze transforms, it kind of resets all that and says, no, this is the default state. And so you want to make sure to delete your transforms at the end of the process so that that is clean, so that it doesn't try and undo itself, or so that it has that default state where it's like, okay, this is my natural state as a finished model. So I'm actually going to Control Z and step back to undo that. So my transforms are already frozen, but just out of habit, I start once again by deleting the history, which I did, which cleans stuff up, and then I can freeze transforms. Let me show you another quick example to explain why this process can be so important. So if I create a few more objects, so I've got 3 cubes, they all look the same, but they're in different states. If something gets reset, so for example, those get set back to their 0 state, that will come in the same spot and it won't be finished. This cube, the one I've got for my default, I actually want to be larger in scale. So I just scaled it up uniformly. And so I'm going Modify Freeze Transformations. That is now its default state. This one, on the other hand, when I zero it out, let me step back. I'm going to hit the 4 key for wireframe. You can see that is its default state. So they're both at 0, and this is their default state. So the other thing I want to point out very quickly is also just the naming. There's a reason why it's important to name your objects. It's so that they're easier to find and they're easier to work with. So for example, this one is my cube 1, my cube shape 1. I know which one that is so that I don't confuse it with these 2 default ones of p cube 2, p cube 1. You can understand if people are not naming their objects, and especially if you're working in a complex scene where there are many things being built. So let's say it's like a restaurant and there are different types of tables and chairs and things like that. If people modeled those out of a cube and they never bothered to change the names, you're going to have a bunch of people submitting p cube 1, p cube 2, p cube 3, p cube 4, and so on and so forth. And it's hard when you're trying to manipulate things or adjust things to figure out which object is which based off of the naming. So naming is very important. All right, so this is now this only object, and it's my cube 1, my cube shape 1. The other place that you can check for the cleanup process is the outliner. So to find that, you can go to Windows, Outliner. So under the outliner, it shows the 4 cameras that are built in, so perspective, top, front, and side. It shows my object, this my cube 1, the default light set, and the default object set. If there are other things in there, even if I may not see them at first, like that, I can no longer see it here, but when I open up the outliner, I can go, hey, there's what I made, but then there's this other thing, and you want to actually clear those out. In some cases, through the modeling process, you're going to gain a lot of history, you're going to gain a lot of other things that can actually create problems. When you go through this cleanup process, and you delete history, freeze transform, sometimes it will leave behind something we call an empty node. It'll look like a little white page with a little red arrow on it. That symbol is also used for groups and things like that, but you'll see some empty nodes where you've got your object and then there'll be other stuff in here, and those sometimes have to be manually deleted out in order to keep a clean object. Now, another thing I want to point out, since there are these 4 cameras that are being shown, are the different viewports. So I can come here and select this panel, and that does the single layout. I can also come down to the one below it, and this gives me the 4 viewport. Now, the way this can be very useful is when I need to adjust or manipulate things. In a lot of cases, it's helpful to be able to see the things from different directions. So yes, this is helping me see it in the 3D space, but I may want to line it up exactly. So if I hold down the X key and snap to grid so I can get this lined up to a very specific coordinate, I can do that. So let's say I want to take this exactly up to that point on the grid, this one down to exactly that point on the grid, and then holding the X key to that point. From the sides, I want to grab both of those and scale them just a little bit to right there. And you can see that allows me to work between. Now, if I want to get it to be a little bit larger, I can hit the spacebar key to go in and out of this viewport. Now, where my mouse highlights is where I'm going in and out of. So get used to moving your mouse around to the different viewports and using the spacebar key to be able to shift between them. But those are where those correlating cameras are. All right. So with all these updates, and by the way, anything that you create, any of these windows that you may pull up, they can be dropped in different locations or adjusted. or you can simply close them and reopen them. But with those changes, I now need to go through this process again. It's still named. I've still got my object named, but I need to, once again, edit, delete all by type history, and modify freeze transforms. There we go. So my object is now cleaned. It's still at the origin. I have named it, and I'm going to do one other thing before I save it. That last one is to add a material. For right now, while you're just getting used to the modeling tools, don't worry too much about materials, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. So for right now, if you save the scene with the initial shading group and Lambert 1 applied, that's fine. But down the road, when you start creating textures, you actually want to avoid the Lambert 1. The default material can cause a lot of problems. Based on what's applied into it, the default material in some game engines will actually just simply not function. Objects with the default material will be given whatever the engine's default material color is. So even if this default material has the texture applied, it will sometimes just turn like a purple or a pink or another color to indicate, hey, this had a default Lambert 1 material applied, you need to remove it. Because you need to create custom things for objects that are going to be used. So the way I can do that is by opening up the hypershade. Once again, don't stress too much about it now. I'm just showing this so that you've got a heads up going down the road. But if I go to Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, I can come here to Create, and I can select a new Lambert. Once again, I want to name things. So I will call this my cube underscore matte. And then I can do an underscore 1 if I'm going to have multiple ones. But I've got a new material on here, and so now if I select this object and I hold down the right mouse key, I can go Assign Material to Selection, and you notice without that base material applied anymore, I'm down to these 3 tabs. So once again, for your own projects, as you're exploring just the modeling process right now, don't stress too much about having a new material on there. We'll cover that in later videos. But I just want to make you aware that that's something you want to do to help with the cleanup process. So I've got it named, I've got it at the origin, I've got it, the history's been deleted, the transforms are frozen, so it's all 0s and 1s. It's got its custom material applied, and now I can save it. So File, Save Scene As, and because I had my project set, I can go My Cube and save it. So that's the basic cleanup process. You want to make sure that things are modeled at the origin at right angles. You want to delete history, you want to freeze transforms, and you want to save your files at the end.